lounging, son.
Welcome back to the Comic Lounge. My name's Ryan, and with me today is an absolute legend in the comic biz. I have Mr. Roy Thomas with me, the first successor as editor-in-chief for Stan Lee, created The Vision, Luke Cage, Carol Danvers, Adam Warlock, Damian Hellstrom, Morbius, Valkyrie, and so many others, Wolverine, part of Wolverine, Squadron Supreme. I mean, I could go on. So happy to have you on today, sir.
Love that. Good. Part of what part of Wolverine did I create? I mean, the arm, the left elbow.
Well, you were part of, Len Wein and everything, So I just so much stuff that you're a part of at Marvel, and I mean, just Marvel alone, is one conversation. I mean, everything else you've done too is a whole nother conversation. But welcome to the show.
Well, nice to be here.
So, I always ask somebody, especially the first time I'm talking to them, I always like to ask, like, what kind of started your love for comics, and when did you realize that was kind of your calling? In terms of what did you want to do for a career?
Well, quite different answers. As far as discovering comics, I seem to have been no older than 4 years old. I could have even been a little younger, but I was no older than 4 when my mother told me that I saw them on sale at this drugstore in Jackson, Missouri, with her, and I was attracted to it. It was probably a Superman or a Batman, more likely than anything, and said, "What's that?" I think I already had seen some comic strips and things, and here was more drawings like that, but of these characters, these weird looking characters. It appealed to me a lot, and I never stopped reading comics, even when the superheroes went away. In the 50s, there was never a month I didn't buy at least a few comics. It would be Archie or a Western or Pogo or Mad or a science fiction comic or something. But I didn't really ever make a decision to be in comics. Back around 63 or 64, I sent a sample strip of into, I think it was the Justice League, into DC Comics to the editor, Julius Schwartz, and he never really responded to it. I wasn't seriously thinking about getting a job. I was thinking they might take it and they might do something with it or use it as the basis of an idea. And then the next year, when they were going to start the Elongated Man series as a solo series in Detective Comics, Julie Schwartz, through Gardner Fox, who had written the first one, which hadn't come out yet, told me he'd like to, maybe I'd like to take a try at it. And I did, but I never heard back from Julie. And Gardner said, well, it wasn't quite what he was looking for. That's the most I ever heard about that. But I never really was trying that hard. I was just doing my fanzine, Alter Ego, at that time, did an issue or two, and I sent it in to the DC editors whom I knew. I sent one to Stan Lee and any other editor or professional I happened to have the address of. And what weirdly happened is that I suddenly just got a letter one day in early 1965, when I was teaching high school. I got a letter from Mort Weisinger, who was the editor of the Superman group of comics, the 7 or so comics he was in. Mort was someone who had been a childhood friend of Julie Schwartz. They were both editors at DC, although Mort was the main editor, if anything, since he was in charge of Superman, just offering me a job as a 2-week tryout starting that summer. So, and I hadn't applied for this job directly, and I had only exchanged 1 or 2 innocuous notes with Mort Weisinger before, but I guess he had asked Julie, and Julie said, yeah, I like him, he's good, or whatever. And so I guess that was a recommendation. But I never really tried particularly to get into the industry. I already had a fellowship to do graduate work at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. in foreign relations, and I was all set to do that just to get away from high school teaching, which I didn't enjoy, when all of a sudden I got this other job and I kind of accepted it instead.
That's awesome. I mean, like they often say, I mean, your name is definitely thrown in as part of like that first generation of comic book fans to grow up and then in turn enter the industry. Whereas like the generation before, like comic books were created back then, So how did you land with Marvel? When did that take place in working with Stan?
That took place about 2 weeks after I got to New York, a little less. I arrived there, and Mort Weisinger, I just showed up I had told him exactly what day I was coming in, so I show up, and he says, well, we can't start paying you till next week, which he had not told me before, or I would have started coming next week. But anyway, he had me hang around the office for that week, And I was sort of, I guess, vaguely being at least a little bit trained by the guy I was succeeding at the job, Nelson Bridwell, was one guy who had been a fan and had been in the field for about a year because he'd had that job as Mort's editorial assistant for about a year, but somehow Mort just didn't want him to be that job anymore. So then the next week I started it, for pay and everything. It's actually started on a Tuesday because there had been a July 4th weekend, so there was nothing on Monday. So I had those 4 days that I finally was actually paid for. But in the meantime, I'd wanted to meet Stan Lee because I thought he was doing the best comics, much as I like Julius Schwartz with, Flash and, Justice League and stuff like that. I was aware of the fact that Stan was writing, and as far as I was concerned, Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko were drawing the best, some of the best, and most of the best comic books around. And I had only exchanged one or two little notes with Stan. He had sent me an issue of Spider-Man I had somehow missed once, but we'd had very little contact. But I said I'd like to take him out for a drink sometime, just to thank him for sending me that comic book, which meant a lot to me, and just to meet him because I liked his writing so much. Of course, you tell Stan you like his writing. That's not the worst thing in the world. And he told me over the phone when he had called me I had written him a letter, so he was saying this. And when he called me at the phone number I gave for the hotel, the George Washington Hotel. I had a George Washington thing that year, I guess. And he said that he didn't, he lived out on Long Island. He didn't have time to, hobnob with people much, but would I like to take a writing test? He was looking for a writer, which I did not know. So this is another job in comics I didn't know about or really didn't apply for. And he had me take the test, and over the next day or two, without meeting him, I came up to the office, got the test from somebody else, Flo Steinberg, actually. I took the test, took it back the next day, and I met Saul Brodsky, the production manager. Still had never met Stan or, whatever. And then finally, the next day, I got a call at DC, asked me to come over on my lunch hour, and I did. And Stan met me. We were very friendly. We never discussed the test. I guess I passed it, but he never mentioned it to me. But we just talked for about 15 minutes or so, and then he offered me a job. And I was very unhappy by that stage with the job at DC because Mort Weiser was a sadistic bastard, very talented man in his own way. He had co-created Aquaman and Green Arrow and various characters, but just a mean, mean guy. And I was just very unhappy working for him. And he had reneged on about 10% of the salary he had offered me. He offered me 110 a week. And when I got there, it suddenly became 100. So I was just, generally annoyed. Yeah. I was determined to make it. But then when suddenly Stan offered me another job, even at a smaller company, which was a third or so the size of DC at best at that time, I said, fine, just offer me the same 110 he was going to offer me. And so when he did, I said, I'll go back. I'll give Mort 2 or 3 weeks notice, and I'll be back whenever he says, that wherever he says it's okay. Well, as soon as he found out I had accepted that job, even with giving him 2 or 3 weeks notice, he said, you're a spy for Stan Lee, and he kicked me out. Don't throw me in that briar patch, right? So an hour after I leave Stan's side, I'm back there, and that weekend I'm writing dialogue for a Millie the Model story. So I actually doubled my money for that week. Thank heaven Mort Weisinger threw me out. Thank heaven Mort Weisinger was such a bastard, because if he hadn't been, I just stayed at DC. And while I liked that, I think it was probably better for my career long term to go to Marvel, which was a rising company and where I could sort of become automatically, bad as I was, I became within a couple of months the second major writer there because I was only the second writer there, period, except for his brother Larry writing Rawhide Kid. So it was really a lucky stroke that got me into the comics, and it was a lucky stroke that took me to Marvel Comics, where I stayed, for the next 15 years.
Yeah, I love that story. I mean, like we'll move forward and talk some about that stuff, but I mean, like Marvel would be a very different company without you. Like there's so many the different things that you had your fingerprints on in terms of like just bringing in certain properties, like licensed properties that weren't there, that I know you had a major part in. I'm kind of curious, what did that test look like that you were given?
Oh, the test, yeah, I only have one sheet of it, but I still do. Yeah, what it was later there were other versions of it, but what it was 4 pages of an encounter between the Fantastic Four and Doctor Doom. That was actually, it was pages from, if anybody wanted to look it up, Fantastic Four annual number, I think it was number 2, the one with the Doctor Doom specialty.
Yeah.
In the latter part of the book, there's a 4-page kind of battle scene and so forth that they took. They just took the black and white stats of the art. They whited out all balloons. I mean, they didn't even leave the shape of the balloons. They were just the artwork, and wrote little notes on the side just to make sure I was clear what was going on. It would say like, enters room, I mean, which I could see anyway, or has fight. It didn't say much of anything, and I just had to write dialogue to go with that. Obviously, even if I'd had the book at my side, I wouldn't look at it. That wouldn't prove I could write it. The funny thing is, writing that dialogue doesn't really prove I could write Marvel comics. It doesn't prove I could plot anything, right?
Mm-hmm.
All it does is prove that I could write dialogue. I guess Stan figured if you can write dialogue, he can probably, write the plots, because, plotting wasn't Marvel's biggest thing anyway. So I guess he liked it, but as I said, we never discussed it. That same test was given a couple of months later to Denny O'Neil at my suggestion. And also, but later, about a year later, when my friend Gary Friedrich took the test, it was a different version of the same thing, 4 different pages from a different comic. But I think Denny and I and Tom Fagan, another person who took the test at the same time as Denny, we're the only 3 people I know that took that version of the test. However, Saul Brodsky told me that earlier, some kind of test had been given to something like 100 people that answered an ad in the New York Times in the previous few months.
Wow.
And Stan didn't like any of them. So I guess, I guess it wasn't just dumb luck that I wandered in. I must have been able to, write dialogue that he at least, but I was such a fan of the Fantastic Four that naturally, even if I wasn't going to write it exactly perfectly, at least I knew sort of how they talked. And I guess I sounded like I could get the character right enough, and Stan figured that was close enough.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, he definitely saw something in you, I mean, not only do you become one of the writers at Marvel, but eventually you succeed him as the second editor-in-chief at Marvel. So I mean, obviously back then, I know, like, they always talk about the Marvel bullpen and stuff, like, like everybody like very closely working together. I mean, you don't see that in comics nowadays, obviously, but what was it like, especially like, because you were editor-in-chief while you were writing comics at the same time. So what was it like juggling both of those positions?
So you're talking about that period from 72 to 74 when I was editor in chief, right?
Yes.
Yeah, because there wasn't much of a Marvel bullpen actually in the terms of people being in the office. When I went to work there was Saul Brodsky, the production manager. Stan had his own big office. Flo Steinberg was like the secretary gal Friday, as they called her at the time. Marie Severin was there as a production assistant, doing paste ups and maybe a few little art corrections. And there was a guy, Steve Skates, a writer who had been hired a couple of weeks before on the basis of writing Stan a letter or something in a comics forum that Stan liked, and hired him. And but he was gone soon, about a month or 2 later. So, but there were only us 5 or 6 of us in the entire that were Marvel Comics. Everybody else was a freelancer. They might come in and work for an hour or 2 in the office, sitting up with a little drawing board on their knees or something, or against a table. But that was pretty much it. By the time I became editor in chief, there were a dozen or 2 people working there in a larger bullpen room. Although I just had a rather small office myself, nothing compared to Stan's. But it really wasn't that hard. It was hard in one sense, writing and editing at the same time, in the sense that once I had gotten to the point like Stan, where I would only come in 2 or 3 days a week to the office. And in fact, I think that was Stan's suggestion, which was great with me because it was like getting a raise. I got the same salary, but I only had to come in 3 days a week. And what I wrote at home was counted as freelance. So I got paid extra for it instead of having to work at night. But when I became editor in chief in 1974, I suddenly had to start coming in 5 days a week again. And unless I'd wanted to write, which I never did on my, say, lunch hour or something, all the writing then had to be done at night or over the weekend. So it was actually a 40-hour week, 40 or so hour week job, plus 10, 20 or more hours a week of actual writing. It just became a backbreaking task. And I just found that, within a short time, I just didn't like it very much. We were growing by leaps and bounds in terms of the number of books doing, and I found I was having less and less time to think about them. And I couldn't give up my own writing at the same time, nor did I want to. So after, between 2.5 years, I, stepped down and so forth. And, a couple of years later, I had a chance to come back and do it again, and I accepted. And then I changed my mind before I actually started. So I sort of had that job twice in a way.
Yeah. I mean, like during your tenure, I mean, you've had your hands in so many different groups of the Marvel universe, and so many different creations. Was there any character that you wanted to write that you never got the chance to write?
Actually, the character that I wish I had written, one of the few that I didn't ever write, but I can't say I didn't have a chance to write it if I'd wanted to, was Wolverine, because I came up with,
Yeah.
that part of Wolverine you mentioned.
Yeah.
It's not is the original idea, which is kind of important. It was the name, the fact that he was Canadian, the fact that he was a short and very mean little character. And then, of course, I had asked John Romita to draw a picture of him. So John drew the particular costume and the claws sticking out and so forth. So, I mean, the character would have been different if I had written the issue rather than Len. He would have had a different invented adamantium too. So I was happy with that. But at the same time, he would have still fought the Hulk. He was still probably been in the X-Men a few months later because he was Canadian and they were looking at that time for other countries' creatures or mutants. And also, he would have looked exactly the same because John Romita drew him without any input from Len or me, really. So I wish I had written that, because then there wouldn't have been any doubt for all these years, what I did with Wolverine. If I really had any sense, if I'd been able to see even the 5 minutes of the future, I would have kicked Len off the Hulk for one issue, have him do something else. I'd have come in and written that issue and then come back. But other characters, not that much. I mean, I never had a great desire to write Howard the Duck, much as I liked him. And, or that many other characters. So most of the characters that I've ever wanted to write at Marvel or DC, between the All-Star Squadron and Shazam, I got a chance to write almost every character I ever wanted to write at either company. I mean, I got to write both Visions at one time or the other, the old and the new. I got to write Captain America in the present, Captain America in World War II. I mean, the nice thing about the position I had was I got to do almost anything I wanted to do. If I could persuade Stan it was a good idea, I got to do.
Speaking of persuading Stan about good ideas, getting the license for Star Wars and Conan and bringing that to Marvel, I was wondering if you could kind of elaborate on, kind of your thought and why you thought it was a good idea to bring those properties over to Marvel at the time and stuff like that.
All right. Well, I can't really take that much credit for, for Conan. But I mean, it's shared very much with Stan. What happened is we thought it would be a good idea to expand a little bit. You can only put out so many superhero books, but if there was a way we could get other types of readers, people who like this kind of fiction or that. We had a few Western readers, a couple of things here and there. We even had a war comic, Sergeant Fury. But if we could find other genres, we might get some of the superheroes. We might also get superhero readers, but we might also get people who came on who didn't read the Thor, say, but they might read some new character. So, but the readers were writing letters in to Stan and to Marvel, in other words, and he's the one who saw them, saying either to do Conan or quite often just, why don't you get the rights to some sword and sorcery character that's out in the paperbacks now? There were a lot of imitation Conans out at that time. Brack the Barbarian by John Jakes and Michael Moorcock's Elric and this and that. We didn't think we'd have a shot at Conan because he was obviously the biggest. He was selling, a lot of copies. He was obviously the best by that time I had, read a lot of the stories and everything. But I didn't think we could get him. So we tried for another character. And it turned out that that character was available, but the agent kept dragging his feet because he wanted more money than Marvel was going to offer, which was very little money. And so I just, finally, after a few months of frustration, I just wrote a letter to the literary agent for the Robert E. Howard estate in Texas, Pasadena, Texas, Glenn Lord, and said, look, we can't offer you much money, a couple $100 an issue or something, no royalties, but on the other hand, it might make some people then go to the paperbacks. It might increase his fame and spread. It doesn't hurt anything. You don't have to give anything up. Didn't know if it would work or not. I got a letter right back saying, fine, send me a contract. So we did. And because I had offered Glenn I had been authorized by the publisher after a memo that Stan had me write about why we should do a character like that and why we should license one. It's strange we didn't make up one, but again, Stan never thought about that. He thought the kids said license one, so let's license one. And so because I had felt so embarrassed about the $150 an issue that Martin Goodman had authorized me to offer, and I had gotten carried away and offered 200. That's a 33, 50%.
Yeah.
What kind of, it's a 33% increase. I thought I'd better write the first couple of issues myself because then if Martin Goodman wanted his money back, I could say, well, I won't vouch you for a couple of pages, and that would kind of bring it up to date. If I wrote it, if I only vouched it for 17 pages instead of 20 or something. And that's how I got. Otherwise, I don't think I would have ended up writing Conan. I'd have probably given it to Jerry Conway or somebody else, even though I, liked the material. Once I did 2 or 3 issues, there was no chance I was going to give it to anyone else. I discovered I really did like doing it. And so that was basically it. So that was really a combination of the readers and Stan and me kind of all having that idea. And it eventually, after a slow start, Conan actually became, by the middle 70s, one of the 2 or 3 biggest successes, at Marvel, biggest sellers at Marvel for some time. Star Wars was a whole different thing. A guy named Charlie Lippincott, who was sort of doing merchandising for Star Wars about a year and several months before it came out, February of 1976. That's a year and several months before the, May 77 debut of Star Wars. And he came to New York and he couldn't get through to Stan. He tried calling him. Stan didn't want to talk to anybody about licensing anything, particularly movies. We'd done a couple of them, Sinbad, one of the Sinbad movies, but, they never went anywhere. So he came to me through a mutual friend. And we talked, and I said, well, it's not my job. I wasn't editor-in-chief anymore. I was, in fact, I may have already decided to move back to California by that time. And I wasn't really looking, it's not my job to find assignments or licenses for Marvel. But the guy, Charlie, started showing me all these production drawings with these beautiful drawings, and, showed all the characters and all these strange names. And eventually, about halfway through, when he showed me the drawing, they called it the Cantina sequence, which was a drawing of Han Solo before he looked like Harrison Ford, facing an alien about to slap leather in this saloon with some stormtroopers and aliens around. And at that stage, I said, maybe we can do something with this. I said, this isn't really science fiction like you told me. This is more like space opera, like I used to like in Planet Comics and, Captain Future and Captain Video and comics like that. And Planet Stories Pulp magazine, I read a few issues of. So I went in and Charlie and I went in and we managed to sell Stan on doing it, mainly because it was free. Believe it or not, we didn't have to pay a penny for doing all those issues. Eventually, if it went on beyond those first bunch of issues that told the story, and after a certain amount of reprinting, they suddenly had to start paying a royalty. But in the meantime, Marvel, as it turned out, even before the movie came out, the book was selling pretty well for 2 or 3 issues. And then about the middle of the 6 issues adapting the movie, the movie came out. And then the sales really went through the roof and they started reprinting the early issues and they put them together into tabloids and they just made, a mint of money. I didn't make a mint of money out of it, but George Lucas and Marvel Comics made a lot of money out of it, especially Marvel. And so that's the way it was. So it was sort of, it was somebody just suggesting it to me, and I thought maybe it was a good idea, but it was more like I thought it was an interesting idea to do and that it might be fun to do, rather than I thought that it would end up saving Marvel Comics' ass at a difficult financial time, as it turned out that it was.
Yeah, I mean, what a stroke of luck. I mean, like you said, the movie wasn't even out yet. So there was no way of knowing the popularity that it would have, and then in turn, like what it would do with the comics.
Now, the circulation director, just a few weeks before it came out, or rather, as we were preparing it, he caught me in the hall. Very bright guy, and he said, can we do this? He said, you said you want 6 issues to adapt this. I remember that 6 times, only about 17 pages of story, so it's not a huge amount of pages to adapt a 200-page movie script. But I said, I feel we need a half a dozen issues. So they said, okay. Then he said, listen, can you do it in 1 or 2? He said, because I said, well, I'll tell you what. I said, you can do it, and you can do it in 1 or 2, but you can't do it with me. I won't do it unless it's 6. I said, we got 6. I've started working on it at 6. I'm not interested in changing it, but I'll step aside and you can get somebody else to do it. Well, for some reason, even though I don't think George Lucas cared that much, although we had met a time or two, had dinner together and everything, I think they thought that George Lucas cared more that I wrote it, than he probably really did. So they didn't want to lose their writer and, maybe upset George or, that or 20th Century Fox or something, even though it probably would not have. So they kind of backed down. But only about a week or so before the movie came out, that same circulation director saw my friend, the one who had introduced Charlie Lippincott to me, in the hall and said, we're going to take a bath on that Star Wars movie with that comic, and so forth. But they took a bath, all right. They took a bath in money. Later on, they made so much money that even I got $100 or $2 out of it because they reprinted it so often. And I wrote a letter and said, you've sent me practically nothing. Why don't you send me, you used to send me some more money for bringing that idea to you and everything. So they finally cut me a check for a few hundred, but it wasn't enough. So I didn't thank them for it. I just cashed the check. I was pretty mad at them. I said, anything that arrives that's less than 4 figures, I'm not going to send a thank you. And it was about $500, which is a lot more then than it is now. But I still felt it wasn't enough. So I just took it and, but I was very happy to be involved with Star Wars. Once the movie came out, it became such a sacred cow. I realized I wasn't going to have fun with it like I could with Conan, where I could do almost anything I wanted to do. So after a few issues, I dropped off, and I think Archie Goodwin did a great job with it after I left.
Yeah, definitely a great run. And yeah, your Conan run, I mean, it's legendary. I mean, it's a timeless run. I mean, you pair up with Barry Windsor Smith in the beginning of it.
Our third choice for artist.
Yeah. So how did that pairing, you just said your third choice. So how did that come about? How did the pairing with you?
Well, John, Stan and I both agreed. I don't think he suggested it. It was just like inevitable. We knew who we wanted to do it. John Buscema, the guy that we always thought he should be the guy to succeed Hal Foster doing Prince Valiant, if and when he ever retired, because he could just draw anything, and he loved to draw that kind of medieval ancient stuff. But so he had the plot, or if he hadn't sent the plot, it was on the way to him or something. He had agreed to do it. He'd read a couple of the stories. He'd never heard of Conan before. I sent him a couple of paperback books just to see what it was. And he said, "This is the kind of stuff I've been wanting to draw all my life." He said, so he's all ready. Well, then in the meantime, remember I said Martin Goodwin might want his money back for the
yeah.
Well, it turned out he did indirectly. He didn't try to take it out of my hide, but he took it out of the artist. He said, "You can't have one of our more expensive artists on the book. You got to have a cheap artist on the book to get back that lousy $200 an issue, And so that wiped out John Buscema. It also wiped out, because he had a maybe not quite high, but a similarly fairly high rate, Gil Kane, who had been a Conan fan since probably before I was born, or certainly for years and years before I ever heard of him. Gil really wanted to do the book, but I couldn't even ask him because his rate was too high. Stan had suggested a couple of good artists like Don Heck or Dick Harris to do it, but I said I think they're good artists, but I don't think they'd bring the kind of singular quality to the book that I wanted, that Gil would have, and certainly John would have. And I said I just didn't want to use them. They're good on something else, but I didn't think they'd be right on. But in the meantime, we had this 20 or so year old guy, Barry Smith, who had come to the United States, done a little drawing of X-Men and stuff. It was okay. It's like hand-me-down Steranko is what it looked like at the time. But then he'd got into trouble because he didn't have a green card, I guess, to work. And so he got shipped back to, he either had to ship back himself to Britain overnight, or else to London, or else he was going to be thrown in jail, So he left the country, and we were just feeding him a couple of mystery stories here and there. And I had done one story with him with a Conan-like character, just as a, kind of a horror story or a mystery story. And that worked out fairly well. So I told Stan, I said, I'd like to give it to Barry Smith because, if he has the lowest rate we have because he was a new artist. If the other guys were getting 40 or 50, he was getting like 20 at the time, And while that's a lot better, several times what it would be now, it would be several times more now. The fact remains, I thought that, he could kind of afford to do it. He's over there in London. So we shipped him the plot that I had done for John Buscema, and he did a pretty good job with it. And by the second or third issue, he was really rolling on it. So it worked out well for me. It worked out well for Barry. It worked out well for the Robert E. Howard estate, which made money. And, it did get some increased popularity and helped make the movie possible a few years later.
Yeah, it had multiple spin-offs as well. If I at least 2 that I know of, right? Like there was King Conan, and then there was Savage Sword of Conan, I believe, as well.
Plus Red Sonja.
Oh yeah, Red Sonja. Yeah.
Right.
What were some of your before we move forward? Like, what were some of your favorite Conan stories that you wrote?
Well, my favorite Conan story I ever wrote, and I actually adapted it 2 or 3 times in different mediums, once in Conan the Barbarian, once in the black and white, and even once in the newspaper strip that was running for a couple of years, is adapting Tower of the Elephant, which is my favorite of the Robert E. Howard Conan stories by far. And so I adapted that. The funny thing is, we didn't have the right in the contract to adapt any of the Howard stories. We could use the character
Mm.
but we couldn't adapt any of the stories. But later on, once we started working by the second or third issue, I thought, well, I really want to adapt these stories and get them in there too, instead of having to work around them,
Yeah.
and there'd be leave a hole in there. So I worked out a separate deal with the agent that, one at a time. We would ask him, can we adapt this story? Yes. And I somehow by that time the book was selling okay, and we got, and somehow because I know I didn't take it out of my salary this time. Uh, we got the publisher to pay him an extra $50 for adapting that story, and then I'd come with another one, so that I would bounce back and forth between original stories and stories adapting Conan stories, and also adapting stories by Howard that were not Conan stories and turning them into Conan stories, because those Howard's heroes all had the same kind of feel. All I would have to do is take a modern day story or a Western and change it, change the horses into dragons,
Yeah.
and so forth, and put a supernatural element in there if there wasn't one. And then I had a story. It was L. Sprague de Camp had been doing that in the paperback book, so it was a natural thing to do, and I had a lot of fun with it. And that way, I'd become such a Howard fan. I wanted people to be exposed to as much of Robert E. Howard as possible, including some of his prose.
Yeah, I feel like my exposure to Conan was the comics, was the Ultimate Marvel comics. I don't even
Yeah.
think and then obviously, like, as I got a little bit older, I found out there was a movie, and then there's books and a whole history. But yeah, that Conan became a favorite character of mine because of, some of those early comics that I read as back issues. In terms of like your time at Marvel, like, or maybe your entire career, like, what were some of your favorite projects or projects that you're the most proud of?
Well, my favorite all-time comic to write was All-Star Squadron at DC, actually, in which I got to use the entire panoply of DC quality and even some Fawcett characters. I put them all together in one wartime group. Um, Avengers was certainly a favorite, and up there with that, although it wasn't successful, was Invaders, which was the World War II adventures of Human Torch, Captain America, and Submariner, which came first. And Conan was one of my favorites. Those were probably my four favorite projects in comics ever. One at DC and the rest of them at Marvel. But the others I would like in pieces. I mean, I liked doing Submariner, especially when John Buscema was doing it, or Daredevil with Colan was fun, or X-Men with Neil Adams. Anything with Neil Adams was fun, except for the deadlines. And so and when I got a chance to work with a good artist, and I got a chance to work with some of the best artists, I didn't get a chance to work with Jack Kirby much, or Steve Ditko, just one or two little things here and there. But I got to work with both Buscema brothers and Kane, and Barry on his way up, and Bernie Wrightson a couple of times, and Ross Andrew, who's a favorite, and Marie Severin was very entertaining, and all these other people. It was really, really a lot of fun to be able to work with all these people. I feel very fortunate.
Yeah, speaking of like collaborations, I mean, there's so many collaborations in comics that like one name is synonymous with the other. But I was wondering if there was any artist that you worked with that you clicked, maybe. Not that I'm not saying like it's your favorite artist to work with, but maybe one that you clicked with more than any other artist.
The main one would be Buscema.
You sound.
I mean, there was nobody any better or more exciting in certain ways than Neil Adams. I mean, we clicked, we clashed, we did everything there. But and because Neil was so wonderful. But John, was probably my favorite collaborator of all time in terms of artists. But other people, I mean, Barry on Conan while we worked together briefly. The Jerry Ordway at All Star Squadron just did a wonderful job for the issues, but first inking other people and then penciling himself. And I was so sorry when he left that book. But Gil Kane was a favorite, collaborator of mine. We first really hardly knew each other before we worked together on the Captain Marvel book one day, and then after that we worked together a lot because he discovered he liked working from stories that I did, and I gave him a chance to co-plot them and put in what he wanted to. And Ross Andrew, who was an undervalued artist, Rich Buckner, who was an up-and-coming artist. I mean, and there were a lot of other people, Sal Buscema at the beginning, and so forth, especially. I mean, I just feel very fortunate to have been able to work with these people, but probably Buscema was my all-time favorite collaborator.
Okay. And as we get like towards like what you're doing currently, I want to ask, like, so many of your creations have been brought to life on the big screen. What is that? How does that feel for you as like the creator watching, like, after all these years, seeing them brought to life?
Well, it's really a kick, you know. I mean, when they started uh the things with, you know, the Spider-Man and, well, Blade, Spider. So actually, Marv Wolfman was one of the first people to get their creations on the screen. But and then, you know, obviously Stan and Jack and Steve. But you know, when they first did a bunch of those, it just didn't occur to me they were, even with the X-Men movies, they were very likely to use any of my X-Men. You know, I had made up the Banshee and several others, but it wasn't likely they were ever going to use them because they had so many by that time, from Stan and Jack, and then Chris Claremont and Dave Cockrum. And so when they finally did, I guess it's sort of really got into gear at around 2015 when they did the Age of Ultron, and suddenly the Vision and Ultron, two of the major creations I had done for the Avengers, were suddenly in a book, and they were handled very much the way that, you know, I had. I mean, it was a different, and yet at the same time, it was true to the spirit of what I'd been doing in the books, and just took it to the next level. And I felt Joss Whedon really understood what I was trying to do, and did it on a whole different plane for the movies. And after that, I got kind of used to it, but you never get totally. Just today, I went to see the Ant-Man movie, and you know, all I have in there is they use a little elements of that story Harlan Ellison and I did, set in that little world of green people years ago. But at the same time, here's a trailer for the Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, and there's Adam Warlock, you know, which is a character that, although it came out of something Jack and Stan had done, it was a character Gil Kane and I basically designed and created together, even if it's sort of the Jim Starlin version of that character. So, you know, it's just, I get a kick out of seeing him. Sometimes I like what they do with him better than others, but you know, it's okay with me. You know, all I ever want is, you know, I always want a bigger credit than I get. But other than that, I'm very happy about it. You know, it's very gratifying, and something I didn't think until a few years ago that I was ever likely to see.
Yeah, I definitely love. I think what I think is great about Marvel is characters that you wouldn't necessarily think you would see brought to life are being brought to life. You know, like Guardians of the Galaxy was something out of left field. You know,
Right, right.
them even doing an Ant-Man solo movie to me
Mm-hmm.
was kind of like I was shocked. Like the other characters didn't like kind of supersede that.
Stan and I were always big on Ant-Man. I remember when they did that movie, Honey, I Shrunk the Kids.
Yep.
I remember Stan and I discussed that once. Well, now that they do that, they can do an Ant-Man movie. I said, because that was so good, and had an ant in it and everything. And Stan was always pushing for an Ant-Man movie, which is funny because it hadn't really worked that well in the comic books. You know, he hadn't been a big thing. He had to be turned into Giant Man. He'd pop up occasionally, but he was never a big deal. But in the movies, an Ant-Man is a good idea because you could put him in situations that work out much better than they do in the comic books.
Oh yeah, definitely. As we wrap up, and you know, like I know we're getting short on time, I just wanted to ask, like, what are you currently working on? I know that you still work on your alter ego zine, like you said you did all those years ago, and then I know you did a little stint on the X-Men Legends book where you did get to write Wolverine finally too.
Yeah, yeah. I they asked me to write something from the X-Men, more or less the period when I was writing it, and I sort of picked that period in between when I was writing it and when the X-Men book came back with Wolverine and so forth. Because you know, the X-Men book, to bring the X-Men book with all these international characters, have been sort of my idea. Although I left being editor, you know, before it came out, so it didn't have my name on it. So I just thought it'd be kind of fun to play around with that. It was almost a little like, you know, if I had actually written that, you know, Incredible Hulk number 181 and so forth, or at least written stories around it. And it turned out there was a good opportunity to do that, so I did. Other than that, I still write a couple of Tarzan and John Carter strips for the Edgar Rice Burroughs online site, and I have a few projects of my own, things that I own, creator own. There was an alter ego superhero comic character that we did back in the 80s, and the artist and I are working on another issue of that, and Captain Thunder and Blue Bolt, another creation of mine that my wife Dan and I own. And this isn't something that I own, have a part of, or will make another dime out of if it's sold 1 million copies. But this kind of book is kind of funny, so I would like to
Oh, that's
point it
awesome.
out. This is coming out from Abrams Art Book sometime in the next very few weeks,
Oh, very
and it's
cool.
about something I didn't actually like, the Marvel value stamps of the 1973-74 period when I was editor in chief. This was something Stan kind of shoved down my throat because I didn't like the idea that they'd have to cut up the comic books to cut these stamps out. But if Stan wanted Marvel value stamps, Stan got Marvel value stamps. But this book, as I told Charlie Cookman, who's Abrams, who's the editor, I said, this book is about 10 times better than it deserves to be, because it's got every letters page that had the stamp on it, and then opposite it has the piece of art they used, wherever it came from, some other source. So it's got a lot of information there. Then it has a British version of that came first for a few pages, and then there are a few revivals later on. And I wrote about a several thousand word essay about how much I hated the book, the stuff, and so forth. But I made that kind of funny, so I'm kind of pleased with that. So this is a book that I think people might want to pick up, even if they're never heard of Marvel value stamps. I think it's kind of an entertaining book on its own.
That's awesome. I can't.
Yeah.
I mean, that's such a great idea. Abrams puts out some really good stuff. So that's
they put out some very fine books in the last couple of years. I've done pieces of some, and they did some of those blacklight posters and things of that sort. And so I'd like to be involved with that. I do a lot of introductions for Marvel books. I was doing their Conan stuff, but also other things from time to time, and occasionally other things. A book came out of the strip Funky Winkerbean.
It sounds familiar.
Paper strip. Well, I did an introduction for a new volume of that coming out. I mean, it's just kind of fun to get to write about some of these things and an appreciation for that kind of thing. But other than that, and I'm working on finally on my autobiography, not because my life was so interesting, but in writing about it, it gives me a chance to write about a particular period in comic books that was, I think, a very crucial and important period.
Yes.
Even if I wasn't around for the first few years of Marvel comics per se, or for those early years of DC bringing back the superheroes in the late 50s and early 60s, the fact remains that I was there for enough of it. And because I was in the office a lot, and was working, I wasn't just a freelancer sitting at home typing, I became kind of integral by accident. And I got to know the artists, the writers, and how Stan thought, and so forth. And then later, of course, I also knew Julie Schwartz and the other people. So I thought, and so I've been avoiding for several years while somehow mentally avoiding starting the book. And one day about the end of last year, coincidentally, I think just about a day before what would have been Stan's 100th birthday, and I just sat down and wrote. And now it's 2 or 3 months later. I've got about 20,000 words written, but I'm still only in the 8th grade, so it'll take a while to finish the book.
Well, that's a book I definitely want to read. I love getting to read the
Can I
book.
put you down for that? How much? I'll put you down for.
Yeah, put me down for that, because I love books by the actual person. I mean, like getting it directly from your mouth, your words, is something special. So I can't wait for it. And I want to thank you so much for taking time to chat with me today. It has been an honor and a privilege to be able to sit here and talk some comics with you. And if you ever have time in the future, I would definitely love to do this with you again sometime.
I can't do it except when my manager John is here, because he's the only one who knows how to set up Zoom, and he comes down a couple times a year.
All right. Well, if he has time, I'm down to do it again.
We'll see what happens. Anyway, thank you very much. It's been a lot of fun.
Thank you so much. Have a good one.
Bye.